Some sins wear their mask in hymns rather than in shadows. It begins with a stained teacup delivered to Baker Street, a fragile vessel concealing a secret that would unravel a clergyman's spotless name and drag a Sunday of worship into a tale of fear and deceit. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The bells are about to toll, and with them, we follow Holmes into the heart of a mystery long buried in silence. It was upon a Sunday morning of singular serenity that I found myself once more in our well-known sitting room at Baker Street, basking in the rare luxury of unbroken leisure. The smoke of my companion's pipe had been mercifully banished for the hour, for he had taken up his violin and was drawing from it a series of plaintive chords which seemed more a meditation than a melody. The winter light slanted through the curtains, dim but steady, and the fire upon the hearth sent up a warmth most grateful to one who had been out late on rounds the previous evening. Holmes sat near the window, his tall, lean figure bent slightly forward, the bow held with delicate precision in his long fingers. His eyes, half closed, seemed to gaze upon some inward picture, while his instrument spoke for him in tones alternately wistful and abrupt. I knew these moods of his too well to disturb them. To one unacquainted with his curious nature, it might have appeared that he was simply idling away the morning. But I had long since learned that beneath such apparent abstraction there lay the restless machinery of a mind which seldom ceased its labour. For myself, I was content with the Sunday edition of the papers spread across my knees, while the steady crackle of the coals and the occasional soft scrape of bow upon string made a background against which I could lose myself in idle reading. Thus the morning passed in a domestic quiet, most uncharacteristic of the life I had come to share with the world's greatest consulting detective. Yet even in those moments of calm, I knew well enough that fate was rarely inclined to grant us more than a brief respite. Presently, Holmes laid aside his instrument and took up his pipe with an air of deliberate ceremony. He sank into his armchair, crossing one long leg over the other, his gaze fixed not upon me nor the fire, but upon some point of space that seemed to absorb him entirely. Turbulence. Not turbulence, Watson, only truth. It is the pursuit that sustains me. Deprived of it, I become like a hound kept too long from the chase. He rose again, restless as ever, and paced across the carpet, his dressing gown flowing about him like the folds of a scholar's robe. He paused to glance at the clock upon the mantel, then returned to his chair with an impatient shrug. It was typical of him. Repose was but a mask. I could sense, even in the small rituals of pipe and violin, the mounting impatience of a spirit that awaited the next summons to action. And as I looked upon him, I could not help but wonder what incident would next break through the fragile calm of our Sunday morning. The answer came almost upon the thought, for a sudden knock resounded through the passage, sharp and urgent, breaking the quietude as a pebble breaks the surface of a pond. Holmes's keen eyes flickered towards the door, even before Mrs. Hudson appeared, a sealed parcel balanced in her capable hands. "This was just brought for you, sir," she announced. The messenger gave no name. Holmes accepted the package without rising, turning it slowly in his hands while his features sharpened with interest. The brown paper bore no mark save for our address, and the twine was tied with a precision suggestive of deliberate care. "Curious," murmured Holmes, weighing it as one might a piece of evidence already half solved. No sender, no instructions, yet a direct delivery. "Watson, I fancy our Sunday will not remain tranquil for long." I confess that a thrill of anticipation stirred within me. The stillness of the morning had been broken, and I sensed, even before Holmes set his keen mind upon it, that the parcel would draw us once more into the web of mystery and human intrigue from which no long peace at Baker Street was ever free. There is something peculiarly unsettling in the arrival of a package for which no sender claims responsibility. As Mrs. Hudson withdrew, I leaned forward in my chair to better examine the object which had so abruptly disturbed our quiet morning. It was a modest bundle, wrapped neatly in brown paper, and bound with stout twine, of a size and weight that suggested neither book nor letter, but something more fragile within. "It carries no postmark," I observed, running my fingers along its surface. "Therefore it cannot have come through the general post." "Quite so," said Holmes, who had already tilted it gently from side to side, as though the shifting of its contents might whisper their secret. "Direct delivery, Watson. That fact alone proclaims deliberation. See here, no smudge, no crease. The paper is freshly cut and tied. Whoever dispatched this wished it to arrive swiftly and unblemished." There was, I confess, a subtle air of menace about the silent little package. In the hearthlight it seemed almost to intrude upon the room like an unbidden guest, its very anonymity more eloquent than any label could have been. A small chill passed through me, for I knew too well that such tokens seldom presaged anything save mystery and disturbance. Holmes placed the package upon the table and bent over it with the exactitude of a surgeon. His fingers moved with astonishing delicacy as he traced the line of the knot, examined the fibers of the string, and finally lifted the parcel to his nose with a brief, thoughtful inhalation. "Twine of hemp," he murmured. "The knot is a sailor's hitch, neat but hurriedly drawn. The paper, notice its coarse grain. This is not of London manufacture, but provincial. And here, the address is penned in a hand that strives for anonymity, yet betrays a clerk's discipline in its even strokes." I could not but marvel at the rapidity with which he summoned these conclusions from so little. To my eye it was but a neatly tied bundle. To his, bare the secret it had concealed. To my astonishment, the package contained but a single object, a porcelain teacup of the most delicate workmanship, its thin china gleaming faintly in the firelight. At first glance it seemed innocuous enough, yet closer inspection revealed an irregular stain along the inside curve, dark and spreading, like a shadow that refused to wash away. The blemish lent the cup a sinister aspect, as though it had been marked for some hidden purpose. Holmes held it to the light, turning it slowly, while his eyes narrowed with that peculiar intensity I knew so well. "A teacup, Watson," he said softly. "An object of domestic comfort, yet here transformed into a message." I felt, in that moment, a disquiet I could not readily define. Why should anyone trouble to dispatch such an item, unless it bore within it some meaning beyond the ordinary? That this was no random selection, but a carefully chosen symbol seemed beyond doubt. Holmes sank back into his chair, the teacup resting lightly in his hands, his gaze fixed, not upon me, but upon the dancing fire. He reached for his pipe, which he lit in silence, and soon the thin smoke spiraled upward into the still air. At length he spoke, his tone low and deliberate. "Mark me, Watson. The tranquility of our Sunday morning has ended before it truly began. The sender of this token has chosen his hour well. We are upon the threshold of a design, the contours of which we have yet to grasp, but which promises little of peace." The teacup gleamed in the glow of the coals like some relic unearthed from a grave, its stain a mute proclamation of secrets yet to be revealed. And as I looked upon Holmes in his armchair, framed by smoke and shadow, I knew instinctively that the course of our day, and perhaps many days to come, had been irrevocably altered. The sight of that solitary teacup, resting in its brown paper cradle, struck me with a sensation oddly disproportionate to so trifling an object. It was of the finest porcelain, eggshell thin, its surface tinted with a pale luster that caught the firelight in delicate shimmers. Yet for all its beauty, the cup seemed strangely out of place, like a bird's egg laid upon a battlefield. Holmes handled it with the care of a jeweler examining some precious gem, his long fingers tracing the smooth lip and finely wrought handle. "A teacup, Watson," he murmured, "but no ordinary one. Observe the quality of the glaze, Continental, I should judge, most likely from Dresden. Its age is not inconsiderable, and yet it has been preserved with the greatest care until now. I confess that an involuntary shiver passed through me. To send such an object, wrapped so deliberately, spoke of purpose far beyond whim. Why should anyone dispatch to my companion a fragile relic of the breakfast table, unless it bore within it some hidden significance? The incongruity of the gesture made the thing all the more sinister. Holmes set it upon the table between us, and for a long moment we both regarded it in silence, as though it were no mere article of porcelain, but some token freshly unearthed from a grave. It was Holmes who first bent closer, his gaze fixed upon the interior of the cup. "There lies our true message, Watson," he said quietly. At the base, running in an irregular crescent along the curve, was a stain of peculiar hue. Neither the golden brown of tea, nor the darker tincture of coffee, but something between rust and earth, as though time itself had marked the vessel. The blot spread unevenly, its edges feathered, giving it the look of some unnatural growth upon a living surface. "This," Holmes observed, "is no residue of ordinary beverage. Note the texture where it has dried, granular rather than smooth. I would hazard it is the sediment of some vegetable matter, or perhaps a mineral solution." He scraped delicately with his penknife, holding the faint dust to the light. "Yes, unmistakable. Yet I shall not pronounce further until I have tested it. Still, we may safely say it is neither harmless nor careful script. At morning song, the truth shall rise." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "Ah, as I suspected, a hymn verse. Do you recall it, Watson? It is from the collection of Dr. Watts, frequently sung in our parish schools. A curious choice, would you not say? To me it was only perplexing. That such a fragment should be concealed within a teacup, itself disfigured by a cryptic stain, seemed less a message than the wandering fancy of a disturbed mind. Yet Holmes's expression told another tale. He tapped the slip lightly with his forefinger, his lips compressed in thought. "This, my dear fellow, is no random utterance. Here we have a signal, couched in the language of piety, but intended for a very worldly end. We are being invited, though whether as witnesses or adversaries remains to be seen." The words hung in the air, charged with the promise of events yet to unfold, and I felt the first true stirring of that familiar anticipation which had so often preceded our most singular adventures. Holmes rose without a word, bearing the cup in both hands as though it were a fragile relic of antiquity. He crossed to the side table where his chemical apparatus and lenses were kept, and there, under the bright beam of his lamp, began a minute inspection of the stain. I watched his profile as he bent low, the lamplight catching upon his keen eyes and hawk-like nose, the whole figure of him one of concentrated energy. "See here, Watson," he said at last, beckoning me closer. He had adjusted his lens over the discoloured portion of porcelain. "Note the granulation. Do you observe how the particles cling, like iron filings upon a magnet?" I bent to look, but could distinguish little beyond a dull residue clotted at the bottom. Holmes gave a short laugh at my perplexity. "Do not be disheartened, my dear fellow. To your eye it is but a smear, but to mine it is a confession. These are not tea leaves nor coffee grounds, but traces of a decoction of bark, seldom encountered outside certain colonial practices. Now, why should such a substance find its way into a teacup? And more, why should it be sent anonymously to Baker Street?" He straightened, his long fingers tapping the rim of the vessel. "There lies our first chord in the melody, Watson." I have yet to hear the refrain. His eyes flickered toward the slip of paper with the hymn line, and I knew he was already weaving both strands together, though he left me in darkness as to the harmony he perceived. It was the verse, however, that occupied my mind. I took it up again, repeating aloud the curious words, "At morning song, the truth shall rise." The cadence was familiar, yet the context eluded me. and I rummaged vainly in my memory of Sunday services past. Holmes, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, pipe once more between his lips, and regarded me with that half-smile which bespoke amusement more than impatience. "You seek to recall the hymn entire, Watson, but I assure you the sender has no wish for us to be edified by its full piety. The single line is chosen with purpose. It is not the hymn itself, but the time it marks, the Sunday morning, the hour of song that forms the key to our cipher." His words struck me with an odd sense of foreboding, as though a commonplace fragment of worship had been transformed into a signpost pointing towards something grim. Holmes rose and stood over the table, where the teacup and the slip of paper lay side by side. "We have here, Watson, two tokens, a vessel with a stain, and a verse from a hymn. Alone, each is a curiosity. Together, they form the skeleton of a riddle." He tapped the cup with his finger. "This speaks of substance, something physical, tangible, perhaps long concealed." Then, lifting the paper, he continued, "This speaks of time, an hour, a setting, an event tied to devotion. What mind, then, would join matter and moment, unless to direct us to a crime rooted in both?" I gazed at him in wonder, struck anew by the ease with which he drew structure from fragments. "But to what crime can a teacup and a verse allude?" I asked. "That, my dear fellow, is the question to which our sender devoutly wishes us to find the answer. And we shall." His voice carried a quiet certainty, the kind that always preceded discovery. A long silence that he leaned once more into thought, his gaze fixed upon the stained vessel as though it were an oracle, while I sat in uneasy silence, knowing full well that whatever peace we had enjoyed that morning was now gone beyond recall. It was scarce an hour since the arrival of the mysterious teacup when the hush of Baker Street was again disturbed, this time by a summons more urgent and insistent. The bell clanged in a manner that spoke of trembling hands and a mind ill at ease. I glanced at Holmes, whose eyes had already quickened with that peculiar brightness I had come to recognize as the herald of action. "Not a tradesman's touch, Watson," he murmured, listening to the echo die away. "There is haste in that ring, haste and fear." Mrs. Hudson's discreet tread soon followed, and the murmur of voices in the hall reached us faintly through the closed door. Holmes had risen and stood with his hands behind his back, his tall figure erect, his gaze fixed expectantly upon the entrance. When at length the door opened, it admitted not a parcel or messenger, but a visitor whose very presence seemed weighted with distress. The young lady who stepped hesitantly into our sitting room bore upon her countenance the unmistakable marks of prolonged anxiety. She could not have been more than 24, and there lingered about her features a refinement which spoke of good breeding. Yet her pallor was such as one sees in patients suffering from long vigils, and the nervous clasping of her gloved hands betrayed a spirit near to collapse. "Pray be seated, madam," said Holmes with that grave courtesy which he could assume when the situation demanded it. "You have come, I perceive, in some perplexity. Compose yourself. You are among friends." Her eyes moved rapidly from Holmes to myself, as though measuring whether she might entrust her fears to strangers. She sank at last into the chair Holmes indicated, her lips trembling as she attempted speech. For an instant she pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, and I thought she might faint outright. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock upon the mantel, until Holmes, with infinite patience, spoke again in tones at once soothing and commanding. "There is no need for alarm. State your trouble plainly, and we shall see what remedy can be applied." Before she had uttered a word of her story, Holmes had already taken stock of her with that swift, comprehensive glance which missed no detail. I saw his eyes note the faint creases upon her sleeves, as though from long and anxious travel. The tremor of her gloved fingers, betraying agitation held barely in check. and the faintest smudge of dust upon her hem, which suggested she had come hurriedly through the streets without regard to her appearance. "Your courage is to be commended, Miss," he began. "Fenwick, Clara Fenwick," she answered in a low, hurried voice. Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Fenwick, then. You have travelled here directly and without the protection of a companion. The matter that has brought you is therefore both pressing and of a private nature. I shall ask no more until you are ready to speak. I confess that I marvelled, as I so often had, at his ability to draw such conclusions from the merest trifles. To my eyes she was but a frightened young woman. To Holmes she was already a page of evidence waiting to be read. At length, summoning her resolution, Miss Fenwick began to speak, her voice trembling with every syllable. "My father, gentlemen, passed from this life but 6 months since. He was for many years churchwarden at St. Michael's in Kensington, and though stern, was held outwardly in much respect. Since his death, however, I have been haunted by a succession of anonymous letters, left at my door or slipped beneath it, each bearing words that chill me to the marrow." She drew from her reticule a folded slip of paper, which Holmes received with delicate— "You stand, I fear, at the heart of a design darker than you yet realize. But take courage. We shall see whether Sunday brings a reckoning for you or for another." Miss Fenwick sat for a moment with her hands clasped, her eyes lowered, as though reluctant to disclose what weighed upon her. At last she spoke, her words coming in a low and hurried stream, like water breaking through a narrow channel. "My father, gentlemen, was for many years a churchwarden at St. Michael's. Outwardly, he was respected by his congregation. Indeed, many would have described him as austere, even devout. Yet within the parish there were always whispers, hints of controversies that were never publicly spoken, but which hung about him like an unseen shadow. There were murmurs of missing accounts, of sums unaccounted for in the offertory, of parishioners who looked at him askance though no formal charge was ever laid." Her voice trembled, and she pressed the handkerchief more tightly to her lips. As his daughter, I was shielded from much of this, but I could not help overhearing fragments, arguments hushed as I entered the room, names spoken in angry tones, and above all the burden of secrecy which grew heavier in his later years. She paused, her pale face turned toward the firelight. "It is this past, I fear, that returns now to trouble me. For since his death, I feel as though I inherit not only his house, but also the enmity of those who believe themselves wronged." "Your account is most instructive, Miss Fenwick," said Holmes, leaning forward with his keen gaze fixed upon her. "Yet I perceive omissions which do not escape my notice." She started, her eyes widening. "Omissions?" "Precisely. For instance, you have spoken of missing sums, but you have not told us whether your father ever faced formal accusation. Nor have you explained the nature of his disputes with certain parishioners. You pause at the threshold of detail, as though some shame forbids you from passing further." A flush of colour rose to her cheeks. "It is true," she murmured after a struggle. "I had thought to spare his memory, but perhaps honesty is best. There was talk, though it never reached a court, that my father had entrusted funds to another, a clergyman, who betrayed his confidence. Yet others believed that my father himself was complicit. The matter was hushed to avoid scandal, but the suspicion never wholly lifted." Holmes nodded slightly, his eyes glittering. "You have done wisely to speak plainly. Concealment is a poor ally when danger presses. Remember, those who now threaten you act upon what they believe to be truth, however distorted." Her fingers trembled as she reached into her reticule, from which she drew a folded slip of paper. "This is the most recent of the letters," she said faintly. I had not meant to show it, for its words cut deeply. But you must see. Holmes took it with a delicate touch, unfolding the page so that both he and I might read. The message was brief, the words clipped and severe, written in a hand that sought to disguise its character. At morning song the truth shall rise. Leave the house or face your father's fate. A chill passed through me as I read, for the line echoed precisely the verse we had found within the stained teacup. Holmes' expression did not change, but I noticed the slight tightening of his lips, as though confirmation of some dark suspicion had just been placed before him. Remarkable, he murmured. The same hand that sent the cup sends this also. The hymn line is not chosen idly. It is the cipher of a mind that delights in grim symbolism. The question is not whether you are threatened, Miss Fenwick, but whether the hour of threat is close at hand, and for that we must prepare. Miss Fenwick's eyes filled with dread, and I confess a shiver ran down my own spine, for I sensed that we stood upon the threshold of a mystery in which piety and menace were woven inextricably together. There are few things more disconcerting than Holmes in one of his silent moods. After Miss Fenwick's disclosures, she sat trembling by the hearth while I attempted such reassurances as I could muster. Holmes, however, neither spoke nor moved. Stained teacup and the threatening notes. That Holmes already discerned some unity among them was evident, and I found myself watching eagerly for the moment when his deductions would leap forth, like sparks from flint struck at last. It came with such abruptness that both Miss Fenwick and I started in our chairs. Holmes halted suddenly in his pacing, removed the pipe from his lips, and said in his crispest tone, "You have been under surveillance for several weeks, Miss Fenwick." The young lady gave a faint cry, her hands tightening upon the arms of her chair. "Surveillance?" she gasped. "But how could you know?" Even I could not disguise my astonishment. "Surely, Holmes, you cannot speak with such certainty upon a matter she has not herself confessed." But Holmes only smiled faintly, that peculiar smile which suggested amusement at our ignorance rather than unkindness. "It is as plain to me, Watson, as the print of a boot upon soft earth. Our visitor has told us much without intending it. The question is not whether she has been watched, but how long she has endured it in silence." Miss Fenwick looked from one of us to the other, her eyes wide with mingled fear and wonder. "You are right," she whispered at last. "I have indeed felt myself observed, though I scarce dared speak of it. At times I thought it no more than a morbid fancy. But you know it with such certainty, Mr. Holmes, that I tremble to think what else you may divine." Holmes moved a step closer, his gaze travelling from her bonnet to her shoes with the calm deliberation of a naturalist examining some rare specimen. "Observe, Watson," he said, turning slightly toward me, the faint scuffing upon the outer edge of the soles, consistent, not with ordinary promenade, but with a woman who has crossed frequently to the opposite pavement. She alters her route to elude a follower. The dust upon the hem of her skirt is not of Kensington High Street, but of a narrower lane. She has chosen back ways in preference to the thoroughfare, and here he touched lightly the brim of her bonnet, a small tear in the ribbon, recently repaired. That, I fancy, is the work of a hurried movement. Perhaps a glance behind her shoulder, when she caught it upon a rail or wall in her haste. Miss Fenwick pressed her hand to her lips, her face pale as marble. "It is true," she confessed. "I have altered my walks, taken byways, hurried at every sound of step behind me. I thought myself fanciful, but you have read me as though I were a page in a book." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You are not fanciful, madam. You are pursued, and it is my task now to learn by whom and to what end." It was as Miss Fenwick endeavoured to explain the manner of her recent alarms that Holmes, who had remained with folded arms and watchful eyes, suddenly lifted one finger in quiet reproof. "You said, madam," he observed, "that they had followed you." She started, colour rising in her cheeks. "Did I? I meant, surely, I must have spoken carelessly." Holmes shook his head. "Not carelessly, but unconsciously. Words, Miss Fenwick, are often truer than intentions. In that brief phrase you betrayed more than perhaps you know. This pursuit, then, is not the act of some vague and unknown enemy, but of one whose identity you already half suspect, though you shrink from naming him. Her eyes fell instantly to her lap, and I saw her gloved hands clench together with a convulsive pressure. She made no reply, but the silence itself was eloquent. Holmes pressed her no further, but resumed his slow pacing before the fire, as though satisfied that her own tongue had furnished him with the key he sought. For my part, I marvelled once again at his faculty for seizing upon the smallest slip and erecting from it a structure of inference which seemed at once audacious and undeniable. Holmes resumed, in a tone at once grave and measured. You labour under the belief that these threats are aimed at you personally. I tell you, madam, that you are but the inheritor of a burden not of your making. This business has its roots in your father's past, and above all in his service as churchwarden at St. Michael's. It was there, amidst Sunday school accounts and parish offerings, that the seed of your present peril was first sown. Miss Fenwick raised her head in sudden fear. But how can you know that? She whispered. Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes remained sombre. The hymn verse, its allusion to morning worship, the teacup, with its stains suggestive of some deliberate preparation, the repeated mention of Sundays in the anonymous notes, all point not to chance, but to a deliberate echo gravely in his duties. Nothing was ever proven, yet the suspicion clung like a stain that no denial could wash away. I would have buried the memory with him, but it seems others are determined that it should rise again to torment me. Her eyes, lifted in appeal, were filled with a mingling of dread and shame, and I confess that my heart went out to her. Yet Holmes remained unmoved, his face set with the calm detachment of a physician diagnosing a malady. "My dear Miss Fenwick," he said at last, his voice firm but not unkind, "you are wise to have come here. But mark this well, the letters are not the sport of idle malice. They conceal a design as deliberate as it is dangerous. The shadow that menaced your father has now turned upon you, and if you are to outwit it, we must act with vigilance and speed. Trust me, and speak of this to no one beyond these walls." She inclined her head, pale but resolute, and Holmes turned once more toward the fire, his figure outlined in the glow. I saw that in his mind the fragments of the puzzle were already knitting together, though what shape the whole would take was hidden even from me. The streets of London wore that sombre hue peculiar to late autumn, when the leaves, sodden by frequent rain, cling in damp clusters to the paving stones, and the air hangs heavy with a chill that penetrates even the stoutest coat. Our cab rattled through Kensington Road, the steady beat of the horses' hooves forming a grim accompaniment to the silence within. Miss Fenwick sat opposite us, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the passing scene, yet seeing nothing of it. More than once she started at the mere cry of a street seller or the rattle of a cart, and I could perceive how deeply the menace of her unseen persecutor had unsettled her nerves. Holmes, for his part, leaned back in the corner of the cab with eyes half closed and chin upon his chest. To the casual observer, he might have appeared drowsy or indifferent, but I, who knew him best, could see that his mind was alive with silent calculations. His long fingers tapped lightly against his knee, keeping time not to any external rhythm, but to the inward march of thought. The sky above was of a dull iron grey, and the air seemed laden with unspoken forebodings. It was as though the very city had clothed itself in sympathy with the anxiety that weighed upon our young companion's heart. At length the cab turned into a quiet square, and there rose before us the Fenwick residence, a house of fine proportions, but singularly devoid of warmth. Its dark brickwork loomed against the ashen sky. The windows shuttered, though the day was yet young, and the iron railings glistened with recent rain. There was grandeur in the design, but it was the grandeur of severity rather than comfort. No flower box relieved the stern facade. No cheerful smoke curled from the chimneys. The house seemed to repel rather than invite, and I confess I felt an involuntary chill as we alighted at the steps. Miss Fenwick hesitated before the door, as though the very threshold oppressed her. Holmes, ever alert to such signs, offered his arm with quiet courtesy. "Courage, madam," he said gently. "We go not as intruders, but as allies. Let us see whether the shadows within these walls are of men or of memories." The heavy knocker fell, and its hollow reverberation seemed to echo longer than was natural, as though the house itself were reluctant to yield up its secrets. We were admitted by a servant whose manner was as stiff as the house he served, and presently ushered into a sombre drawing-room where the master of the house awaited us. Mr. Horace Fenwick was a man of imposing stature, broad of shoulder and square of jaw, with iron-grey hair brushed severely back from a brow furrowed by deep lines of authority. His eyes, sharp and searching, fell first upon his niece, then upon Holmes and myself, with an expression that bordered on hostility. "Well, Clara," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "so you have brought strangers into our affairs. Is this the manner in which you household, sought by sheer force of bearing to overawe both guest and niece?" He spoke brusquely, questioned sharply, and dismissed with a wave what he termed the fancies of nervous women. Holmes, however, was not a man to be shaken by bluster. With quiet precision, he met each thrust with an observation so calmly uttered, yet so penetrating, that the elder man found his assumptions subtly undermined. At one point, Holmes remarked upon the recent repolishing of the cabinet lock in the corner of the room, and at another, upon the absence of dust upon its hinges compared with the surrounding furniture. Mr. Fenwick flushed darkly at these seemingly casual comments, while I could not but note that Clara glanced anxiously toward the very cabinet Holmes had singled out. There was a silence, charged with unspoken tension, until Holmes, with the faintest smile, resumed his seat as though nothing of moment had passed. In that instant, I perceived that beneath the courteous words there ran a deeper current of contest, and that Holmes, without raising his voice, had already seized the advantage in this battle of wills. It was Clara herself who, with a glance half timid, half imploring, drew our attention to the great oak cabinet that stood in the shadowed corner of the room. Its dark panels, heavily carved with grotesque figures, bore the polish of age, and yet its presence seemed oddly intrusive, as though it held a secret it dared not yield. "My father's papers were always kept there," she said in a low tone. "Since his death, I have wished to examine them, but—" She faltered, for Mr. Horace Fenwick had turned sharply upon her. "Enough, Clara," he said with stern authority. "That cabinet is not to be touched. Its contents are the concern of the head of the family, and the head of the family is myself. I will not have strangers prying into matters that are private." His words were uttered with such force that Clara shrank back as though struck. I felt a surge of indignation, but Holmes, who had been leaning with apparent indolence against the mantel, merely inclined his head as though the rebuke were of no consequence. Yet, I saw his eyes glimmer with sudden interest, and I knew that the cabinet had assumed, in his estimation, a place of singular importance. Feigning an idle curiosity, Holmes sauntered across the room, his fingers trailing lightly along the edge of the cabinet, as though he admired its workmanship. He stooped to examine a hinge, then straightened with a glance at the lock, which gleamed with the faint lustre of recent polish. "You keep your furniture in excellent order, Mr. Fenwick," said he carelessly. "This cabinet, for example, remarkably well preserved for so old a piece." The elder man's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Holmes bent again, his gaze flicking toward a faint series of scratches near the keyhole, half concealed beneath the varnish. To me, they suggested nothing, but I saw Holmes's lips tighten in that peculiar way which told me he had noted a fact of weight. He tapped the wood lightly with his knuckles, listening with the air of one who reads a language invisible to others. In all this, he maintained the mask of indifference, offering some trivial remark upon the carving of the panels. Yet, when he turned away, his expression, brief and fleeting, bore the unmistakable stamp of discovery. The remainder of our visit passed beneath a veil of strained politeness. Mr. Fenwick, though outwardly courteous, maintained an air of suspicion and reserve that rendered conversation a hollow form. Clara spoke little, her eyes often straying to the forbidden cabinet, while Holmes, urbane and unruffled, engaged our host in a few observations on the parish, which were met with brusque replies. At last Holmes rose, declaring that we had trespassed sufficiently upon Mr. Fenwick's time. Our farewells were spoken with the stiff civility of men who part without trust, and we soon found ourselves once more in the chill air of the square. It was only when the cab had borne us a short distance from the house that Holmes leaned toward Clara and spoke in a tone low but decisive. "Take courage, Miss Fenwick. That cabinet holds the very heart. Hymnals, parish registers, concordances, and volumes so dust-laden that I marvelled at the speed with which he had acquired them." His thin figure bent low, the lamplight falling across his aquiline features, while the smoke from his pipe wreathed upward in slow, curling tendrils. For more than an hour he neither spoke nor stirred, save to turn a page or make a brief note upon a scrap of paper. I could hear the steady scratching of his pen mingling with the occasional crackle of the fire. His concentration was so absolute that the bustle of London beyond our window seemed but a distant murmur, unheeded by both of us. At length he leaned back, eyes half closed, and tacked the open hymnal before him. "It is not the common verse, Watson," he murmured. "Many a hymnal omits it altogether, while others place it in altered form." Whoever selected that line for Miss Fenwick's torment was not idly quoting. It was chosen with calculated precision. We must learn where and when it has been sung in London churches. As he spoke, a sudden memory stirred within me. "Holmes," I said, "that verse. I could swear I have heard it before, many years ago. It was during my boyhood, in a small parish church near my father's house in Berkshire. I remember it well, for the phrase, 'the truth shall rise,' struck me as peculiarly solemn. It was sung at matins on a Sunday when we children were gathered at the schoolroom adjoining the church." Holmes's eyes brightened, and he sat forward sharply. "Excellent, Watson. Your recollection provides the very clue I required. The line is not of universal use, but appears in certain editions peculiar to specific parishes. If your memory is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, then its occurrence at St. Michael's in Kensington is no mere chance. The hymn is localized, and so is the threat." Holmes rose and moved briskly to a side table, from which he produced a slim, time-worn hymnal, its leather binding cracked with age. "I obtained this," he explained, "through one of my correspondents who deals in antiquarian volumes. It belonged, in fact, to the very parish of St. Michael's." He laid it open before me, and there, beside the hymn in question, a faint pencil mark traced along the margin caught my eye. The scrawl was scarcely legible, but Holmes pointed with his long forefinger. "Observe, Watson. Sermon, June 14th. Dispute in vestry after." The note was clearly made by some parishioner of the time, and it refers to a specific Sunday morning. That, I think, was the day upon which the hymn was sung, and upon which an event occurred that has since cast its shadow forward into Miss Fenwick's life. I could not repress a shiver as I realized that the anonymous threats were not the idle work of a mischief-maker, but the deliberate echo of some long-past scandal, remembered by one who sought to use it for menace. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the hymnal resting upon his knees, and regarded me with that grave intensity which I had learnt to associate with the unveiling of a vital clue. "Picture it, Watson," said he. "A congregation assembled on a bright Sunday morning. The hymn is sung, its words rising to the rafters. 'At morning song the truth shall rise.' And at that very hour, in the vestry adjoining, something occurred. something discreditable, scandalous, and long concealed. Whether it was the misappropriation of funds, the betrayal of trust, or some darker sin, we do not yet know. But it was linked indelibly with that hymn, that day, and that church. Our present enemy seeks to revive it, to drag it forth once more as a weapon. He closed the book with a decisive snap. The trail, Watson, leads us back to St. Michael's, to the day when that hymn was sung. There lies the nexus of the case, and there we must direct our inquiries. I glanced at the marked page once more, and it seemed to me that the very ink upon it carried the weight of a bygone sin, waiting to be unearthed. Holmes, with the hymnal still upon his knee, leaned forward into the glow of the fire, his eyes glittering with
Of circumstance I cannot yet say, but the fact is clear. The money was collected, and when the vestry books were next examined, it had vanished. A scandal was whispered, hushed, and buried. Yet buried scandals have a way of clawing back to the surface, and it is that shadow of the past which now darkens your path. I confess a chill passed through me at the calm precision of Holmes's words, for in them lay the suggestion of guilt, attaching itself like a curse to the memory of the dead. The young lady had risen half from her chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the back of it for support. Her pale face and wide eyes bespoke the shock of a truth half suspected, yet never spoken aloud. "I remember, yes, I remember," she said brokenly. "That Sunday, my father returned from the church with a look I had never seen before. He was pale and would not meet my mother's eye. When I asked what troubled him, he bade me be silent, and the matter was never mentioned again. I thought it some quarrel, some trivial matter, but now I see that it was this. She sank once more into her chair, her head bowed in despair. The long-buried suspicion, never proven yet never dispelled, had suddenly risen before her with dreadful clarity, and I could not but feel pity for one so cruelly made to bear the weight of another's error or misfortune. Holmes remained standing, tall and grave, his thin fingers pressed together before his lips. At last he spoke, his voice slow and measured, yet carrying with it an authority that left no room for doubt. "The threats, Miss Fenwick, are not vague menaces. They are the deliberate work of one who knows of that vanished money and the silence that followed it. This enemy seeks not merely to torment you, but to compel your obedience, to drive you from your inheritance, or perhaps to force some act of desperation. In short, the same hand that penned these verses means either to silence you or to ruin you. The Sunday morning of long ago is not forgotten, and its reckoning, it seems, has at last arrived." A deep hush fell upon the room, as Holmes's words faded into the crackle of the fire. Miss Fenwick's hands clasped tightly in her lap, and I felt the weight of the case settle upon us all, as though the sins of the past had stretched forth their fingers to clutch at the present. It was on the following morning, as Holmes and I sat in quiet discussion of the case, that a brisk rap sounded upon our door. I had scarce risen when the familiar figure of Inspector Lestrade was shown into our sitting room, his short frame and sharp features betraying the air of a man who came more to criticize than to consult. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," said he, in his clipped fashion. "I trust I do not intrude upon weightier matters. I hear you have taken up some curious business on behalf of a lady in Kensington." Holmes, who had been lounging in his chair with half-closed eyes, greeted him with a languid bow of the hand. "Ah, Lestrade, always punctual when you suspect folly on my part. Pray be seated." The inspector's lips twitched with a faint smile, but his eyes were restless, darting toward the papers on Holmes's table. He tapped his cane impatiently upon the hearthrug, as though eager to pronounce his judgment before the evidence was even laid before him. "I have heard something of this affair," Lestrade began briskly, "and between ourselves, Mr. Holmes, I cannot but think you are being made the victim of a hoax. A teacup with a stain, a line from a hymn,
and a few anonymous notes. Why, it smacks of the nursery rather than the Old Bailey. I felt the blood rise in my cheeks at his tone, but Holmes merely exhaled a thin cloud of smoke and regarded our visitor with amusement. "Then you dismiss them altogether?" asked Holmes mildly. "Certainly. London is full of practical jokers, and ladies of nervous temperament are their easiest prey. If you wish to spend your time examining crockery, that is your choice, but the Yard cannot be expected to chase phantoms." Holmes smiled ever so slightly. "Phantoms, my dear Lestrade, have a way of casting very tangible shadows, and I would wager that this particular shade will prove more substantial than you suppose." As I listened, I confess that my patience grew sorely tried. There was in Lestrade's tone that familiar heighten my own irritation, though I dared not interrupt, lest I mar the quiet battle of wits that was unfolding before me. At length Holmes stirred, knocking the ashes from his pipe with studied leisure. "Lestrade," said he, in a tone at once courteous and grave, "you may dismiss a single clue as trifling. You may regard two as coincidence. But when three independent tokens, each of peculiar character, converge upon the same point, a man of reason must pause." The inspector frowned, but Holmes continued inexorably. "Consider, if you will. A teacup sent anonymously, marked by a stain of singular composition, a slip of paper bearing a hymn verse, identical in wording to the threats delivered to Miss Fenwick, and the fact that these warnings fix upon Sunday, the very day when her late father, as churchwarden, presided over a service clouded by scandal. Is this, as you say, the work of children? Or is it, rather, the careful weaving of a plot?" Lestrade shifted uneasily in his chair, his confidence momentarily shaken. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he muttered, "you put it strongly, I'll grant you that. Still, until something more tangible occurs, the Yard cannot justify interference." Holmes inclined his head. "Then let us wait, Inspector. But I warn you, the hour will not be long in striking, and when it does, the sound will carry from Kensington to Scotland Yard itself." Our debate with Lestrade had reached that curious pitch where courtesy trembles on the verge of impatience, when the sound of hurried footsteps mounted the stair. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson herself appeared, breathless, and behind her a lad in a porter's uniform, his cap askew and his cheeks flushed with haste. "Beg pardon, gentlemen," the boy stammered, "but I was bid to find Mr. Sherlock Holmes without delay. There's been a robbery, sir. A burglary this very night at the Fenwick house in Kensington." At the mention of the name, Clara, who sat in silence near the hearth, uttered a low cry, and Holmes, who had remained composed through Lestrade's objections, was upon his feet in an instant. "Speak plainly, my good fellow," said he. "When and what was taken?" The lad twisted his cap between his hands. "Only this morning was it discovered, sir. They forced a window at the rear, and though there's valuables aplenty in the place, they never touched a one. Went straight for a cabinet in the drawing-room, so they say." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me, and I could read in his eyes the silent confirmation of his theory. The game, which until now had seemed like shadow play, had broken suddenly into violent action. The boy's message, when more clearly recounted, left no room for doubt. The burglars, whether one or several, had left untouched the silver, the plate, and even the small casket of jewellery kept in Clara's chamber. Their object had been singular, deliberate, and unerring. The oak cabinet, that sombre piece of furniture which Mr. Horace Fenwick had so jealously defended from inspection, bore the marks of forced entry upon its lock. What they sought within, no one yet knows, the boy concluded. But the drawers are ransacked, the papers scattered, and the household in great confusion. I recalled with vivid clarity Holmes's apparently idle observations of the cabinet's hinges and scratches, and the subtle tension that had hung in the room when he remarked upon them. That which had been conjecture was now stark reality. Someone else, armed with knowledge and determination, had also identified the cabinet as the heart of the mystery. One might have thought that even Lestrade, faced with such news, would at last acknowledge the gravity of the affair. Yet the inspector only shook his head with a sceptical smile. "Coincidence, Mr. Holmes," said he. "A fine old cabinet attracts thieves as honey draws flies. That they should pass over the silver may seem strange, but there is no accounting for a burglar's fancy. I see nothing here to justify your talk of conspiracies." Holmes, who had resumed his seat with a calmness more impressive than indignation, regarded him steadily. "My dear Lestrade," he said quietly, "we began with a teacup, a verse, and a thrill, almost in silence, our breath rising in faint clouds as we strode through the deserted streets. The lamps still glimmered faintly in their glass globes, though their pale radiance was swallowed by a fog that clung close to the ground like a shroud. Holmes, wrapped in his long coat, walked swiftly at my side, his head sunk upon his breast, his keen eyes darting from shadow to shadow with an alertness that belied his outward calm. He offered no word of explanation, yet from the quickness of his pace and the grim set of his mouth, I understood that our errand admitted of no delay. Thus it was, with the first pale rim of the sun lost in the thickness of the mist, but we turned into the lane leading to St. Michael's. The church loomed suddenly before us, its tower rising spectral and indistinct, while the railings of the adjoining graveyard gleamed with beads of cold moisture. It was here, Holmes had declared, that the truth would at last stir. Within the churchyard, the silence was profound. The fog lay thick among the leaning gravestones, muffling even the fall of our own footsteps. The ivy, dark and heavy with damp, clung to the crumbling wall, and from the depths of the mist came only the faint toll of a distant bell, striking the hour with solemn insistence. Holmes chose a spot where two headstones leaned together, affording a screen from any wandering gaze. From there we commanded a view of the pathway that led toward the Fenwick family plot. He motioned me into place with a finger pressed to his lips, and we crouched in the gloom like sentinels, awaiting an unseen foe. The minutes dragged with an eerie slowness, every creak of branch or flutter of wing magnified by the surrounding stillness. My nerves, despite long service under fire, tingled with a strange unease, for there was in that fog-laden yard an atmosphere of expectancy that set the heart beating faster than reason would dictate. Holmes, however, remained motionless, his tall figure as immobile as the stones around him. At length, leaning close, Holmes spoke in a whisper scarcely louder than the stirring of the ivy leaves. "Watson, we must divide our attention. From where you kneel, you command the angle of the path leading from the north gate. I shall watch the approach from the vestry door. Should any figure enter, do not stir until I give the word. Remember, silence is our ally. Discovery, our defeat." I nodded, tightening my grip upon my cane, for the gravity in his voice admitted of no doubt. He added softly, "Above all, hold steady. Our quarry is desperate, and desperation makes for sudden violence. A signal from me, 3 taps upon the stone, will be your cue to advance. Until then, remain fixed." I pressed his hand in acknowledgement, and once more we sank into silence. The fog thickened, curling about the stones like ghostly fingers, and the very earth seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for some hidden drama to unfold. It was I who first perceived it. A faint stir among the gravestones, so slight that for an instant I thought it no more than the shifting of mist. Then a darker shadow detached itself from the gloom, gliding low and swift between the monuments. The figure paused, crouched, and then advanced with deliberate stealth toward the Fenwick grave. My heart quickened as I caught the glimmer of a spade or tool beneath his cloak. The intruder moved with the assured tread of one who knew his destination well, never hesitating among the rows of stones, but striking straight for that single mound where Clara's father lay. I glanced toward Holmes. He had already perceived the movement, for I saw the slight incline of his head and the narrowing of his eyes. His hand, raised ever so slightly, warned me to hold fast, and so we waited, breathless and still, as the unknown figure bent at last above the grave, his hands working feverishly at the earth, intent upon some secret buried with the dead. The figure, silent as a phantom, sank to his knees before the weathered stone. With a furtive glance about him, he drew from beneath his cloak a small spade, its metal catching the faintest gleam of dawn. I watched, my breath confirmed, yet his lips remained sealed. The quarry, unmindful of our nearness, cradled the case in both hands, as though it held his fate within. It was then that Holmes moved. Holmes stepped from behind the shelter of the gravestones with the easy authority of a man certain of his ground. "You need not trouble yourself further, sir," he said, his voice low, but carrying with it a tone that made the intruder start as though struck. The man sprang to his feet, clutching the case, and darted sideways with the instinct of flight. In that instant, Holmes's calm figure seemed powerless to restrain him, and it fell to me, posted as I was by the pathway, to intercept his escape. My old soldier's reflexes did not betray me. As the shadow brushed past, I thrust out my arm with all the strength at my command, seizing him by the shoulder. He struggled fiercely, the tin box clattering to the ground, and for a moment we grappled among the damp grass and stones. "Hold him, Watson," Holmes commanded. With a final effort, I bore the fellow back against the slab of a monument, pinning him there until Holmes stepped in, his hand firm upon the man's wrist. The intruder, panting and dishevelled, ceased his resistance, realizing that flight was futile. It was then, as the mist thinned with the rising dawn, that the true countenance of our captive was revealed. The hood of his cloak had fallen back in the struggle, and the pale light showed features both familiar and startling. The long clerical coat, disordered but unmistakable, proclaimed his profession. The thin lips and sharp eyes, now wide with desperation, belonged to none other than the Reverend Josiah Pell, a man of no small reputation in the parish. I confess I stood aghast, for I had heard his name spoken with respect in more than one drawing-room. Yet here he was, his face blanched, his breath ragged, his whole aspect betraying guilt. Holmes regarded him without triumph, his grey eyes fixed upon Pell, as though reading the depths of his conscience. "So, Reverend," Holmes said quietly, "your nocturnal labours have yielded the prize you sought. I fear, however, that the secrets within this case may weigh heavier than even your shoulders can bear." The clergyman attempted a reply, but only a hoarse murmur escaped his lips. He cast one glance at the box lying in the wet grass, another at Holmes's unyielding figure, and then lowered his eyes in shame. It was evident to me, even before Holmes spoke further, that we had stumbled upon the very heart of the mystery, and that the man we held was both villain and victim of a past long buried, yet never forgotten. The pale light of dawn, filtering through the dispersing fog, revealed the identity of our captive with cruel clarity. My astonishment was complete when I recognized the angular features and clerical garb of none other than the Reverend Josiah Pell. His name was one held in esteem among the more devout circles of Kensington, a man commended for his piety, benevolence, and unblemished record of service. To behold him thus, panting, dishevelled, and seized in the very act of rifling the earth above Miss Fenwick's father's grave, was so incongruous that I could scarce credit my eyes. "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed, "this is the Reverend Pell." He has preached more than once at the bishop's own invitation. Holmes, however, betrayed no surprise. His grey eyes narrowed, the faintest trace of sardonic amusement touching his lips. "Indeed, Watson," he replied, "our midnight visitor is no stranger to public approval. Yet reputation, like fog, can conceal as much as it reveals." The clergyman himself stood rigid, his face pale, but his eyes darting restlessly, as if measuring the likelihood of escape. "You mistake the matter, gentlemen." His gaze, unwavering, seemed to pierce through the very layers of Pell's self-possession. "Consider your position carefully," Holmes continued. "We know already that Miss Fenwick has been the recipient of anonymous warnings, that her father's memory is entangled in whispers of impropriety, and that this hymn verse," here he tapped the folded scrap of paper on the table, "is the thread which binds all together. Explain, sir, or the law shall draw its own conclusions." For a moment Pell's lips moved without sound, his fingers twisting nervously around his collar. He looked from Holmes to myself and back again, his defiance trembling before the steady force of Holmes's scrutiny. At last, words burst from him, though with more heat than coherence. "I am no criminal, Mr. Holmes. These documents are mine, private letters, accounts of no public bearing. I sought only to secure them from idle curiosity. Surely you would not drag a man's reputation through the mire for the mere act of safeguarding his own papers." Holmes raised an eyebrow, unmoved by the plea. "Private matters," he repeated softly, "buried in the dead of night within another man's grave. A curious method of preservation." Reverend Pell drew himself up, though his eyes wavered. "You speak as though I were a thief or worse. I assure you, the Fenwick family has misunderstood the significance of these tokens. I desired only to prevent scandal, to shield the innocent from pain. Is that so grave a sin?" Holmes's silence was more damning than words. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his expression betraying nothing of the thoughts that moved behind his piercing eyes. As for myself, I could not dispel the impression that the Reverend's vehemence masked a fear more corrosive than simple concern for propriety. The little tin case, now resting upon the vestry table, seemed in its mute fashion to dominate the room. Its dull metal glistened faintly in the morning light, and I confess that, as Holmes laid his hand upon it, a shiver passed through me, for it was as though the grave itself had yielded up some hidden testament. Holmes regarded it not with awe but with cold, analytical interest. "The weight, Watson," said he, tilting the box with a delicate motion, "is considerable for its size. A receptacle for papers, without doubt, but papers of such nature that concealment was judged safer than custody. The grave of an old friend offers a singular, if morbid, vault." Reverend Pell stirred uneasily, his hands clasped before him, his lips compressed into a bloodless line. Holmes's voice cut the silence with sharp clarity. "Why bury what is innocent, Reverend? Concealment is the partner of guilt, and the soil you disturbed bears witness more eloquently than your words." For my part, I could not but marvel at Holmes's composure. The clergyman's respectable name and station seemed but feathers in the scale against the damning fact of his midnight labours. The tin case, though unopened, already whispered of secrets far darker than its battered exterior betrayed. Holmes's gaze fixed upon Pell with unrelenting force. "You remember, Watson," he said, turning slightly towards me, "the accounts of St. Michael's Parish some 15 years ago. A trifling matter at the time, hushed with curious haste, though it caused no little murmuring among the pews." The memory stirred vaguely in my mind, but Holmes pressed on. "Funds collected on a Sunday, funds intended for the poor, were never seen again. The official inquiry produced no culprit, yet those who examined the figures closely knew that the hand which held the keys to the chest was none other than Reverend Josiah Pell." At these words the clergyman half rose, his face livid. but Holmes silenced him with a swift gesture. "You may protest, sir, but the records, though buried in silence, remain. And what is more telling, the hymn verse which has haunted Miss Fenwick is the very one sung on that morning, a day your conscience cannot forget." A dreadful stillness fell upon the room. I saw Clara Fenwick tremble where she sat, her eyes widening as if the veil of years had suddenly been rent. "It is true," cried Miss Fenwick, her voice breaking. "I was but a child, yet I recall one evening my father pacing the hall in agitation. He spoke a name, your name, Reverend Pell, in tones of reproach and dread. I had thought it a dream, filtering through the vestry window. His voice, though measured, carried the weight of judgment. The matter is plain. Reverend Pell, dreading exposure of his past defalcations, conceived that the Fenwick name, linked by circumstance to that Sunday morning, might yet betray him. Hence the warnings, the threats, the burglary directed at the cabinet, and finally this nocturnal desecration. He would silence by fear what he could not obliterate by time. Holmes's eyes flashed with cold fire. Beneath the cloak of piety, Watson, we find corruption. A clergyman in the pulpit, a criminal in the shadows. The case, I venture, is complete. I glanced at Clara, who covered her face with trembling hands, and at Pell, whose silence was more damning than any protest. The tin case remained unopened upon the table, its contents yet concealed. But already its weight bore heavily upon us all. The weight not of metal, but of guilt, long hidden, and now at last unearthed. It was on the following day, a Sunday morning of chill brightness, that Holmes made one of those curious arrangements which, though mystifying at the time, I had long since learned to accept as preludes to revelation. He directed me, with no more than a thin smile, to write notes summoning Miss Clara Fenwick, her formidable uncle, Inspector Lestrade, and, most astonishing of all, Reverend Josiah Pell, to our rooms in Baker Street. "Surely, Holmes," I ventured, "to assemble in one room both the threatened and the suspected is to court disaster." Holmes, who was polishing the bowl of his favourite briar pipe, gave me a glance of amused indulgence. "My dear Watson, disaster is but the offspring of disorder. We shall have order, and with order comes truth. The stage must be set, and the actors compelled to play their parts." He would explain no further, but his calm determination, and the peculiar insistence upon Sunday morning as the chosen hour, impressed upon me the conviction that the denouement of our strange affair was near at hand. There was a curious transformation in our familiar sitting room when the hour came. Mrs. Hudson, under Holmes's direction, had laid a neat service of tea upon the table. The gleam of silver and porcelain lent an air of innocent domesticity to the chamber, which contrasted sharply with the stern expectancy of those assembled. Miss Fenwick sat pale and composed, her hands clasped in her lap as though to still their trembling. Her uncle, Mr. Horace Fenwick, loomed at her side, his watch chain glinting and his brows knit in perpetual severity. Lestrade, restless as ever, stood near the window, muttering occasional complaints about being called from his duties for parlour theatricals. Holmes alone appeared wholly at ease, lounging in his armchair with that air of serene command which seemed to transfigure the most ordinary of settings into a tribunal of justice. I, observing from my accustomed seat, could not help but feel that every tick of the clock brought us nearer to some irrevocable unveiling. It was the Reverend Pell who entered last, his gait hesitant and his complexion wan beneath the clerical collar. His eyes, quick and anxious, flitted from face to face before settling upon the table where Holmes had placed, with calculated negligence, a small key upon a folded napkin. The sight of that modest object seemed to strike him with visible force. He started, half-checked himself, and seated his tall frame with an air of ill-disguised unease. His lips moved in murmured courtesies, but the tremor of his hand as he reached for a cup betrayed a disquiet far deeper than manners could conceal. I noted, too, how Clara, in spite of her courage, shrank slightly when their eyes met. Mr. Horace Fenwick, on the other hand, regarded the clergyman with an expression of rigid disdain, as though his very presence were an affront. All the while Holmes watched, silent, his long fingers steepled before him, content to let the Reverend's discomfort declare itself without a single word. At last Holmes rose, his voice courteous yet carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "My friends," said he, "we are gathered not for ceremony but for clarity. Let us review, as though it were a simple tale, the curious sequence which has brought us here." Faintest smile. "A curious tale indeed," he concluded softly. "And yet, when the pieces are joined, what emerges is not curiosity, but crime." Holmes's manner, so composed and courteous, altered in a moment into that of a prosecutor unveiling his case. With a slow deliberation that held every eye, he extended his long arm towards the tea table. "Let us, if you please, examine our tokens one by one," said he. From a side cabinet he brought forth the delicate porcelain teacup, its faint discoloration visible to all in the morning light. He placed it upon the white cloth with a faint clink. "Here, the first whisper of a mystery, delivered to this room without sender or explanation." Next he unfolded the narrow slip of paper, its single line from the hymn etched in black script, a verse plucked from piety, but wielded as threat. "I need not remind you, Miss Fenwick, how the very same words have haunted your correspondence." At last, with a gravity that drew a murmur from Clara and caused the Reverend Pell to blanch visibly, Holmes set upon the table the tin case, its soil-stained exterior proclaiming its shameful hiding place. "And here," Holmes concluded, "the relic of the graveyard, a case not consigned to earth by accident, but by desperate design." The array of objects, so ordinary in appearance yet heavy with implication, lay before us like the instruments of an unseen trial. Even Lestrade, who had muttered more than once of wasted time, ceased his fidgeting and leaned forward with intent. Holmes's voice, which had begun in calm recital, grew keener, each sentence a tightened chord. The cup was a summons, the hymn a code, the notes a warning. Who but a man of the cloth would think to veil menace beneath a line of worship? Who but one with intimate knowledge of Miss Fenwick's household would dare direct his efforts upon the locked cabinet? He turned sharply upon Pell, whose lips moved in soundless protest. "Years ago, on a certain Sunday morning, parish funds entrusted to your keeping vanished. The late Mr. Fenwick bore the burden of suspicion, yet never spoke. You, Reverend, profited by his silence, and when death threatened to unlock his secrets, you resolved to bury them deeper. First in anonymous warnings, then in a midnight desecration." Each item on the table seemed to gather weight as Holmes's words bound them together. The teacup, the hymn, the tin case, tokens not of chance but of calculation. The chain of guilt encircles but one man. For an instant, Pell's habitual dignity flared. "This is monstrous," he cried, his hand striking the arm of his chair. "I will not—" But his voice faltered, drowned in the heavy silence of the room. Holmes regarded him steadily, and with that gaze the last defences crumbled. Pell's face sagged, his shoulders bent, and his hands covered his eyes. "It is true," he muttered hoarsely. "I took the funds. I meant to restore them, but temptation, circumstance. Oh, God forgive me. When I learned the papers had passed to Fenwick's keeping, I was undone. The girl's inheritance held my ruin, and I sought only to preserve my name." Miss Fenwick gave a faint cry, and her uncle's stern visage softened, if only for a moment. I confess that even my medical instincts stirred in pity for the broken figure before us. Yet the enormity of his deception, cloaked in piety, silenced any thought of excuse. It was Lestrade who ended the scene, stepping forward with a brisk authority. "That will suffice, Reverend Pell. The law is less forgiving than Providence, but it is my duty to place you under arrest." Pell, too spent to resist, allowed himself to be guided from his chair. Lestrade, however, paused before Holmes, his expression a mixture of chagrin and reluctant admiration. "You've outpaced us again, Mr. Holmes. I'll grant it takes a rare mind to make sense of cups, hymns, and cabinets." Holmes inclined his head with the faintest smile. "The world, Inspector, is full of sermons written in objects, if one but has the patience to read them." And so the Reverend Pell was led from Baker these singular proceedings. The Reverend's confession has confirmed what my deductions had already made plain, yet the connecting links may not appear so obvious to you as they did to me. He resumed his seat, lighting his pipe with that air of tranquil satisfaction which I had so often observed after the successful conclusion of a case. A faint smile flickered upon his features as he gestured toward the array of objects still resting upon the table: the teacup, the slip of paper, and the tin case. "Each of these, though trifling in itself, formed an indispensable clue," he said. "Taken together, they compose the chain by which we have bound a hypocrite." Holmes lifted the porcelain vessel delicately between finger and thumb. "You will observe," said he, "that this teacup was no ordinary token. It bore a stain that was not of tea, but of a chemical mixture intended to simulate age and suggest long concealment. Why, then, should such a thing be sent to me?" He leaned back, his keen eyes fixed upon us. "Because the teacup is the very emblem of the crime. Consider, on a Sunday morning, after divine service, parishioners retire for their humble tea, while funds collected lie in trust. To send a stained cup was to whisper of a tainted offering, a desecrated communion of sorts. Whoever dispatched it sought both to taunt and to warn, to revive the memory of an event they feared might otherwise remain buried." Miss Fenwick shivered slightly, and her uncle frowned, though he did not speak. For my part, I confess I felt anew the curious chill that had accompanied its arrival, for the sinister ingenuity of the act was now fully apparent. Holmes replaced the cup with care, as though it were a relic of some dark sacrament. Taking up the slip of paper, Holmes smoothed it upon his knee. The line inscribed here was no random choice. It is drawn from a hymn sung on that very Sunday years ago, when the embezzlement of parish funds occurred. The words, banal in themselves, become pregnant with meaning when tied to that date. He turned toward Clara, his voice softening. "Your father, as warden, presided over the accounts that morning. The hymn, the cup, both pointed to the precise hour of the scandal. The anonymous notes you received were but an extension of the same device, calculated to awaken dread without disclosing the author's hand." I recall vividly the hush that fell as Holmes's words settled upon the company. It seemed incredible that so simple a token could conceal so weighty a cipher, yet the logic was irrefutable. The hymn was the calendar, the cup, the symbol. Together they pointed like arrows to a forgotten Sunday, now resurrected to accuse. At last Holmes's gaze rested upon the tin case, and from thence upon Clara herself. "Your late father, Miss Fenwick, was no thief, though suspicion may have brushed his name. Realizing that foul play had touched the funds, he secured the incriminating documents, ledgers, receipts, and notes of hand, in yonder oak cabinet. He dared neither destroy nor reveal them, for destruction might cast blame upon himself, while revelation would have ruined the parish's standing. Thus he chose concealment, trusting that time would resolve what his conscience could not." Holmes's voice grew more grave. "But Pell knew the truth, and the truth was perilous." The cabinet became the vault of his disgrace, and so long as it remained unopened, his reputation endured. Hence the threats to you, Miss Fenwick, the burglary, and at last the desecration of the grave. His every act was the act of a man cornered, who feared that the dead would rise to speak through mute papers. Holmes set aside his pipe and folded his hands. Such, then, is the chain entire, from teacup to hymn, from cabinet to grave. The plot was of one piece, and its author, as you have seen, has betrayed himself by his own desperate hand. Holmes's long fingers rested lightly upon the tin case, still marked with the clinging damp of the churchyard soil. "This, gentlemen, is the kernel of our mystery," said he. "Its concealment alone proclaims guilt. For what innocent man buries ledgers in consecrated ground?" He drew forth a folded sheet from within. Its edges curled and its ink faded. "Receipts," drawing upon his pipe with contemplative calm. Observe now how the Reverend sought to stifle the ghost of his own misdeed. First came the notes, couched in the language of Scripture, designed to terrify Miss Fenwick and drive her from the inheritance that concealed his ruin. Next, the mysterious parcel, the teacup and hymn verse, a cruel refinement meant to summon dread while masking the sender's hand. When these failed, he turned to bolder measures, a burglary directed not at trinkets or plate, but solely at the oak cabinet wherein he feared the damning papers lay. His eyes gleamed as he spoke, and he leaned slightly forward, still unsatisfied, and maddened by the dread of exposure. Pell descended at last to sacrilege itself, rifling a grave in the silence of night. The pattern is of desperation mounting step by step, warning, theft, and desecration, all pointing to one conclusion: a guilty man cornered by his own conscience. For a time Holmes was silent, the smoke from his pipe wreathing upward in thin spirals. Then, with a tone that was less forensic than philosophical, he observed, "It is ever thus, Watson. The mask of piety sits ill upon a face corroded by fear. Pell's downfall was not wrought by outward enemies, but by the inward whisper of guilt. He might have confessed and endured censure. Instead, he chose the darker path, where secrecy breeds menace and hypocrisy ends in exposure." He turned to Clara with a gentleness rare in his manner. "Your father, though he erred in silence, was no thief. His greatest fault was to shield a villain too long, hoping that time would erase dishonor. The irony is sharp, that the man who preached righteousness should himself be undone by deceit, while the man who bore suspicion in silence has, through death, proved the more honorable." Holmes rose then, stretching his lean frame. "And so, Miss Fenwick, the case is concluded. You are safe. The papers will speak, and the shadow has lifted. Yet let us remember that even upon a Sunday morning, when bells call men to worship, sin may lurk beneath the surplice, and guilt may walk among the gravestones. It is a lesson, Watson, that no man should forget." In the days that followed the Reverend Pell's arrest, the storm that had so long overshadowed Miss Fenwick's life abated, leaving in its place that peculiar calm which comes after danger is dispelled. Yet the memory of those hours clung to me with unusual vividness, and I found myself contrasting our ordinary domestic existence in Baker Street with the sinister drama that had so lately unfolded there. It was on the Sunday, immediately succeeding the affair, that I sat once more in our familiar sitting room, the fire crackling cheerfully in the grate, and the morning papers spread upon my knee. Outside, the bells of Marylebone tolled in steady cadence, summoning the faithful to worship. Their sound, so innocent and benign, recalled to me the darker echoes of that hymn verse, the teacup, and the graveyard tin, all of which had conspired to reveal a clergyman's hidden shame. The air within was warm and homely, yet my thoughts turned again and again to the fragile Miss Fenwick, whose courage had been tested by terror, and to the ignoble ruin of a man who had once been esteemed as a shepherd of souls. The contrast between the peace of our surroundings and the turmoil of recent events seemed almost too sharp to credit, and I could scarce persuade myself that the quietude of Baker Street was not itself an illusion, to be shattered at any moment by another knock at the door. Holmes was in his accustomed armchair, the long, lean outline of his figure illuminated by the glow of the fire. His pipe sent thin spirals upward, and his eyes, half closed, betrayed that peculiar detachment which, I had come to know, indicated not repose, but an inward activity more intense than speech. For some time we sat thus, until at last I laid aside the paper and observed, "It strikes me as singular, Holmes, that a crime of such squalid avarice should be bound up with the outward forms of piety. A church, a hymn, a Sunday morning. These are not the accompaniments one associates with burglary and intimidation." Holmes stirred slightly, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "You are right, Watson," said he, "to remark the incongruity. It is ever the business of crime to masquerade, and where better to find concealment than beneath the mantle of reverence? The wolf, if he in sermons and hymns, is a sin more grievous. It corrodes not only the man, but the very institution he pretends to uphold." He leaned forward, his eyes catching the firelight. "It is not the first time we have seen evil strut in borrowed sanctity, nor will it be the last. The more loudly a man proclaims his virtue, the more closely must we examine his deeds. Pell was undone, not by the suspicion of others, but by the gnawing knowledge that his crime, though buried, would not sleep. His every act was but an attempt to silence his own conscience. And what greater enemy can man have than that?" Holmes settled back once more, his expression softening into thought. The bells outside rang their final summons, and for a moment I sat regarding my friend in the glow of the fire, struck anew by the contrast between his cold precision and the deep moral sense that so often underlay it. It was in such moments that I realized how profoundly the world needed both his logic and his vigilance. For even on a Sunday morning, when peace seems most assured, human deceit may be at work beneath the cloak of piety. Holmes sat in his chair with the slip of paper between his long fingers, regarding it with an expression at once sardonic and contemplative. "Mark it well, Watson," said he. "This humble fragment of a hymn, designed for devotion and comfort, was twisted into an instrument of menace. What was meant to elevate the spirit became, in the hands of a guilty man, a weapon as sharp as any dagger. It is one of those ironies I have often noted, that the very symbols of virtue are most readily perverted by those who seek to conceal vice." He placed the paper gently upon the table beside the stained teacup and the empty case, the trifling objects that had carried so grave a weight. The Reverend Pell imagined that by veiling his threats in piety, they would pass unnoticed, or at the very least, be invested with a supernatural awe. Yet in so doing, he furnished the key that unlocked his own perfidy. Hypocrisy, Watson, writes itself in bold strokes, however fine the pen. I could not refrain from a mild protest. "And yet, Holmes," I remarked, "is it not also true that the hymn itself, by recalling its setting, served justice rather than villainy? Though Pell wielded it as a weapon, it became the very evidence that betrayed him. In the end, the instruments of ordinary worship, of Sunday peace, proved stronger than his falsehood." Holmes inclined his head, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "A fair point, my dear fellow. You are ever the moralist where I am but the logician. Between us, perhaps, we reached the whole." He rose then and stood with his back to the fire, his figure outlined against the glow. "What lesson do we draw? Merely this, that no day, however sacred, is beyond the reach of human folly. Men carry their weaknesses even into the pew, and the cloak of sanctity too often hides the trembling heart of guilt. It is well that justice wears no surplice, but peers beneath every garment. As he spoke, the bells outside tolled their evening peal, filling the room with their mellow resonance. Holmes listened a moment, then resumed his seat without further word, as though he had delivered his verdict not to me alone, but to the very city beyond our windows. The hour grew late. The fire sank low. More chapter in the annals of my friend Sherlock Holmes. Holmes sat back in his chair, the smoke of his pipe curling upward in languid spirals. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "it is not always the violent passions that lead men to crime, but fear of exposure, fear of disgrace. Reverend Pell might have endured censure with dignity had he confessed, but by cloaking his sin in hymns and shadows, he only ensured his ruin. Hypocrisy, my dear fellow, is the heaviest chain a man can forge for himself. And now I turn the question to you. What do you think was Pell's gravest error? His theft, his concealment, or his final desperate bid to silence the truth? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this mystery, do remember to comment, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes tales, and share the story with fellow lovers of the great detective's adventures.